Darius Williams stood at the back of the cramped municipal auction hall, clutching 4 crumpled $100 bills in his calloused palm. $400. It was all the money he had left after 3 months of unemployment, after his position at Ford's River Rouge plant had been eliminated in another round of restructuring. The irony wasn't lost on him. A skilled welder in Detroit, the Motor City, reduced to scraping together loose change just to keep the lights on in his small apartment. What would you do if you had just $400 to your name and saw a chance to own an entire factory? Would you bet everything on a property that made grown men shake their heads in pity? That's exactly what Darius was about to do. The auctioneer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a bored expression, droned through the morning's offerings. Vacant lots, condemned houses, properties seized for back taxes, the usual collection of Detroit's urban decay packaged for desperate buyers. Darius had been to enough of these auctions to know the rhythm. Small fish early, bigger properties toward the end. Next item, the auctioneer announced, shuffling his papers. Lot number 47, former Meridian Electronics Manufacturing Facility, at 2847 Corktown Avenue. 40,000 square feet of industrial space on 2.3 acres. Property has been vacant since 1974. He paused, looking up at the sparse crowd. Bidding starts at $400. A murmur rippled through the room. Darius felt his pulse quicken. 40,000 square feet for 400? Even in Detroit's most distressed areas, that was unheard of. He looked around, waiting for the inevitable bidding war. Instead, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The same expression on every face. Not disappointment or calculation, but pity. The kind of look you'd give someone about to step off a cliff. Margaret Torres, who ran the bodega near his apartment, caught his eye and slowly shook her head. "Don't," she mouthed silently. "Do I have $400? The auctioneer called. Darius raised his hand before his common sense could stop him. $400 from the gentleman in the Carhartt jacket. The auctioneer's voice carried a note of surprise. "Do I have $450? Silence. $450? Anyone? The silence stretched longer than it should have. Darius noticed that while people weren't bidding, they also weren't leaving. They were watching him with the same expression Margaret had shown, like witnesses at a funeral. Going once at $400. The auctioneer seemed reluctant to continue. Going twice. An elderly black man named Winston Price, who'd been coming to these auctions for years, leaned toward Darius. "Son, you don't want that place. Trust an old man who's seen things." But before Darius could ask what things, the gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo louder than it should have. "Sold to the gentleman in the brown jacket for $400. The crowd began to disperse immediately, faster than normal, as if they couldn't get away quick enough. But as Darius approached the clerk to complete his purchase, he caught fragments of hushed conversations drifting past him. Should have warned him. Place has been dark for 40 years for a reason. What happened to the last guy who tried to develop it? The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, handed him the deed with trembling hands. When Darius asked about the property's history, she simply shook her head and walked away without another word. That's when Darius noticed the most unsettling detail of all. Every single person who had attended the auction was now watching him from the parking lot, but none of them were moving toward their cars to leave. They were waiting to see what he would do next, as if they expected something to happen, something that had happened before. The drive to the factory felt longer than it should have. Every mile through Detroit's east side carried the weight of those watching eyes from the auction. Darius couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a terrible mistake. But $400 for 40,000 square feet of industrial space was still $400 for 40,000 square feet of industrial space, even if it came with a side of local superstition. The Meridian Electronics facility sat on a corner lot in Corktown, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had seen better decades. The main building was a classic 1950s industrial structure, red brick and steel windows, built when Detroit was the undisputed manufacturing capital of the world. The bones were good, even if everything else looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Darius parked his battered Ford pickup and approached the main gate. The chain holding it closed was old, but the lock was newer, as if someone had been maintaining basic security despite the apparent abandonment. The key the clerk had given him worked perfectly, too perfectly, as if someone had been keeping the locks oiled despite 4 decades of vacancy. Inside the fence, the grounds were overgrown, but not chaotic. Weeds grew in neat patterns around the loading docks, and the parking lot's paint lines were still faintly visible beneath years of accumulated debris. It felt less like abandonment and more like waiting. The main entrance was a set of heavy steel doors marked Meridian Electronics. Authorized personnel only. The same key that had opened the gate turned easily in the lock. The door swung open with a groan of protest, releasing a rush of stale air that smelled of machine oil, dust, and something else. Something chemical that made Darius's welding-trained nose twitch with recognition. The interior stopped him cold. This wasn't what abandoned factories usually looked like. Instead of stripped copper, broken windows, and graffiti, Darius found himself looking at a time capsule. The main production floor stretched out before him like a museum exhibit. Assembly lines stood exactly where they'd been left in 1974. Conveyor belts frozen mid-motion. Workbenches still held tools arranged with industrial precision. Quality control stations displayed half-completed circuit boards, their components neatly organized in bins that should have been empty decades ago. His boots echoed on the concrete floor as he moved deeper into the space. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows between the machinery, but the electrical system was clearly functional. Someone had been maintaining this place, keeping it in a state of suspended animation. A metal staircase led to the second-floor administrative offices. Darius climbed carefully, testing each step. The stairs were solid, recently painted. More evidence that this wasn't truly abandoned property. The executive floor was a maze of offices with frosted glass doors and brass nameplates. Thomas Meridian, President. Robert Klein, Production Manager. Sandra Walsh, Quality Control. Names from another era, frozen in corporate amber. Darius tried the door marked Thomas Meridian. Locked, but his key worked here too. Inside was an office that looked like its occupant had stepped out for lunch and never returned. A coffee cup sat on the desk next to a stack of production reports dated October 1974. A jacket hung on the back of the chair. A family photo showed a man in his 40s with a wife and 2 young children, all smiling at some long-ago camera. But it was the filing cabinet against the far wall that caught his attention, or rather what was behind it. The cabinet had been pulled away from the wall, revealing scratches in the floor where it had been moved recently. The wall behind it showed obvious signs of repair. Newer drywall that didn't quite match the original construction, painted but not textured to blend seamlessly. Darius had done enough construction work to recognize a hastily concealed opening when he saw one. Someone had walled something up back there, then tried to hide their work behind office furniture. His curiosity piqued. He examined the wall more closely. Running his hands along the surface, he could feel the seams where new material had been fitted. The work was competent but rushed, the kind of repair you'd make if you needed to hide something quickly and permanently. A sound from downstairs made him freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. On the main production floor. Someone else was in the building. Darius held his breath, straining to listen. The footsteps below were methodical, purposeful. Someone who knew the layout of the factory floor. They moved with the confidence of familiarity, not the hesitant exploration of a trespasser. He crept to the office window that overlooked the production floor. Through the dusty glass, he could see a figure moving between the assembly lines with a flashlight. The man was tall, well-dressed in a way that seemed out of place in an abandoned factory. Even from the second floor, Darius could tell this wasn't some homeless person seeking shelter or a scavenger looking for copper wire. The footsteps stopped directly below Thomas Meridian's office. "I know you're up there," a voice called out, cultured and calm. The front door was unlocked, and there's only one set of fresh footprints in the dust. Darius's heart hammered against his ribs, but there was nowhere to run. The office had only one exit, and it led to the same staircase the stranger would use to reach him. "I'm not here to hurt you," the voice continued. "I just want to talk. My name is Vincent Sterling. I represent certain parties with an interest in this property." Against his better judgment, Darius made his way to the top of the stairs. The man below had positioned himself in the center of the production floor, hands visible, making no threatening moves. He appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair and expensive clothes that had never seen a day of manual labor. "Mr. Williams, I presume?" Sterling said as Darius descended the stairs. News travels fast when someone actually buys the Meridian place. "How do you know my name?" Sterling smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Public records. Property purchases are a matter of public interest, especially when they involve historically significant locations." They stood facing each other in the shadow of the massive production equipment. Sterling seemed completely at ease, as if he'd been in this factory many times before. "I'll get straight to the point," Sterling said, reaching into his jacket. Darius tensed, but the man only withdrew a checkbook. "I represent a development consortium interested in this property for historical preservation. We'd like to offer you $5,000 for an immediate sale. The amount hit Darius like a physical blow, more than 12 times what he'd paid, enough to solve his immediate financial problems, and then some. But something in Sterling's desperation to make the offer made him suspicious. That's generous, Darius said carefully, but I just bought the place. Haven't even had a chance to look around properly. Looking around can be dangerous in old industrial facilities, Sterling replied. Asbestos, lead paint, structural instability. A man could get hurt poking around where he doesn't belong. The warning was delivered with a smile, but Darius heard the threat underneath. Are you saying I shouldn't explore my own property? I'm saying some things are better left undisturbed. The Meridian Electronics closure was complicated. There were financial irregularities, labor disputes, some unpleasant business with the IRS. Nothing a working man like yourself needs to get involved with. Sterling pulled out a pen and began writing a check. $5,000 cash immediately. You walk away clean, we handle the mess. Darius looked around the factory floor, at the preserved equipment, the maintained electrical systems, the too clean appearance of a supposedly abandoned building. What mess? The kind that killed Thomas Meridian in 1974. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Sterling had said too much, revealed too much. The mask of polite business interest slipped, showing something colder underneath. Thomas Meridian died? Darius asked. I thought he just disappeared. He disappeared because he died, Sterling said, his voice harder now. Car accident on I-75, very unfortunate. Happened right after he started asking questions about where certain profits had gone. Sterling tore the check from the book and held it out. $5,000, Mr. Williams. Take it and walk away. Darius didn't take the check. And if I don't? For the first time, Sterling's composure cracked. Then you'll end up like the last man who tried to develop this property. Marcus Henderson, 1987. Also had a car accident. Also very unfortunate. The threat was explicit now. Darius felt his military training kick in. Assess the situation, identify exits, prepare for confrontation. Sterling was older but moved with the careful precision of someone who'd handled dangerous situations before. I think I'll hold on to my investment, Darius said, backing toward the main entrance. Sterling pocketed the check, his expression hardening. That would be unwise. Very unwise indeed. Is that a threat? It's a fact. Men who dig where they shouldn't dig in Detroit sometimes don't get to finish their projects. Before Sterling could say more, Darius was moving toward the exit. He heard Sterling call after him, but didn't stop until he was outside the building and back in his truck. His hands shook as he started the engine. As he pulled away from the factory, Darius saw Sterling emerge from the building and walk to a black Lincoln Town car parked across the street. The car had been there when Darius arrived, but he'd assumed it belonged to someone visiting the neighboring businesses. Now he realized Sterling had been watching, waiting. The Lincoln followed him for 3 blocks before turning away. That evening, Darius sat in his small apartment, trying to make sense of what had happened. $5,000 was life-changing money for someone in his position, but Sterling's desperation to buy the property raised more questions than it answered. He pulled out his laptop and began researching Meridian Electronics. The official story was straightforward. A small electronics manufacturer that had closed due to financial difficulties in 1974. But as Darius dug deeper, he found inconsistencies. According to public records, Meridian had been awarded several lucrative defense contracts in the early 1970s, manufacturing electronic components for military communications equipment. The contracts were worth millions, far more than a small factory should have been able to handle. Then there was Thomas Meridian himself. The man in the family photo had been found dead in his car on October 15, 1974, just 3 days after Meridian Electronics had announced its closure. The official cause was a single car accident. Meridian had apparently lost control of his vehicle and crashed into a bridge support on I-75, but the Detroit Free Press archive contained a small item that caught Darius's attention. The accident had occurred at 2 a.m., and Meridian had been driving away from downtown Detroit, not toward his home in Grosse Pointe. The article mentioned that he'd been carrying a briefcase that was never recovered from the crash scene. Darius found a phone number for the Detroit Free Press archives and called the next morning. The librarian who answered was helpful, but puzzled by his request. "You're the second person this month asking about Thomas Meridian," she said. "Funny how a 40-year-old story suddenly gets popular." Someone else was researching Meridian. Older gentleman, very well dressed. Said he was working on a book about Detroit industrial history. Spent hours going through our morgue files. Darius's blood ran cold. Vincent Sterling had been researching Meridian Electronics, trying to find out what information might still exist. Did he find what he was looking for? Hard to say. He seemed most interested in the financial records, employment documents, that sort of thing. Asked specifically about any files related to federal contracts. After hanging up, Darius made another call to his cousin Denise, a public defender who knew her way around legal databases and government records. "Darius, honey, what kind of trouble are you getting into?" Denise asked after he explained the situation. "You bought a factory for $400 and now mysterious men in expensive suits are offering you $5,000 to sell it back. I know it sounds crazy, but something isn't right about this place. Can you help me research the company?" "I can try. Give me the details." An hour later, Denise called back with news that made Darius's suspicions seem like understatements. "Cousin, you need to be very careful," she said. Meridian Electronics had federal defense contracts worth over $12 million between 1971 and 1974. That's about $60 million in today's money. $60 million? For a small electronics factory? That's what makes it suspicious. The contracts were for highly classified communications equipment, but there's no record of Meridian ever delivering anything. The money just disappeared when the company closed. Darius felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together. What happened to the federal investigation? That's the strange part. There should have been an investigation, but I can't find any record of one. It's like the whole thing was quietly buried. What about Thomas Meridian's death? Single car accident? Case closed within 48 hours. No autopsy? Minimal investigation? Very unusual for someone involved in federal contracts worth that much money. After ending the call, Darius sat staring at the factory deed on his kitchen table. He'd bought what he thought was an abandoned building, but he'd actually purchased a crime scene, and someone was willing to kill to keep its secrets buried. That night, he drove back to the factory. If Sterling was so desperate to buy the property, there had to be something worth finding, and Darius was going to find it before Sterling decided that buying wasn't the only option. The factory looked different in the darkness, more ominous, more secretive, but Darius had brought proper tools this time: a sledgehammer, pry bars, and a powerful flashlight. Whatever was hidden behind that wall in Thomas Meridian's office, he was going to uncover it. He parked around back and entered through a loading dock, avoiding the main entrance in case Sterling had someone watching the building. The production floor felt vast and empty in the darkness, filled with shadows that seemed to move independently of his flashlight beam. Upstairs, Meridian's office waited exactly as he'd left it. The filing cabinet still sat away from the wall, revealing the obvious patch job behind it. Darius studied the repair more carefully. The drywall was newer but not recent, maybe 15 or 20 years old. Someone had discovered whatever was hidden here and tried to cover it up again. He positioned the sledgehammer carefully and swung. The drywall cracked, revealing a hollow space behind it. Another swing opened a hole large enough to shine his flashlight through. Inside was a space about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, a hidden closet that had been walled up. And sitting in that space waiting for 40 years was a Mosler safe from the 1950s. The safe was massive, weighing several hundred pounds and built like a bank vault. But what stopped Darius cold wasn't the safe itself. It was what sat on top of it. A human skull, yellowed with age, stared back at him from the darkness. Darius stumbled backward, his flashlight beam wavering across the grinning skull. His breath came in short gasps as the reality of his discovery settled over him. This wasn't just about missing money or federal contracts anymore. Someone had died for whatever was in that safe, and their remains had been sealed away with the evidence. He forced himself to look closer. The skull wasn't sitting loose on the safe. It was part of a complete skeleton, still partially clothed in the rotted remains of what had once been an expensive suit. A tarnished gold watch hung from the bones of one wrist, and a class ring clung to a skeletal finger. With trembling hands, Darius photographed everything with his phone before carefully examining the ring. The inscription was still visible: University of Michigan, Class of 1952, TM, Thomas Meridian. The man who had supposedly died in a car accident on I-75 had actually been murdered and hidden in his own office. Darius's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway. "Find something interesting, Mr. Williams?" Vincent Sterling's voice was cold as winter steel. "How did you—" "Motion sensors. This building has been monitored for decades. Every time someone gets curious about Thomas Meridian's final resting place, we know about it. Darius looked around the office, suddenly aware that he was being watched. "We? You're in way over your head, son." Thomas Meridian thought he was smart too. Thought he could record conversations, keep evidence, use it as insurance. All it got him was a bullet in the head and a permanent residence in his own safe room. "You killed him." Sterling laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "I was 17 years old in 1974, but the people I work for, they have long memories and longer reach. Thomas stole from the wrong family, Mr. Williams. The Torino family doesn't forget debts." The Torino family, even Darius, who'd grown up in Detroit, knew that name. One of the most powerful crime families in the Midwest, with connections reaching from Chicago to New York. Meridian Electronics was a front, Darius realized, for money laundering. Very good. Thomas Meridian was supposed to process payments, clean money through those federal contracts, take his cut and keep his mouth shut. Instead, he got greedy, started recording conversations with Tony Torino, thought he could use the evidence to negotiate a bigger piece of the pie. Sterling's voice grew harder. "Tony didn't negotiate, he made examples, and 40 years later we're still cleaning up Thomas's mess." "The safe," Darius said. "What's in it?" "Tapes. Dozens of them. Conversations between Thomas and every major player in the Torino organization from 1971 to 1974. Names, dates, amounts, methods. Enough evidence to destroy what's left of the family and put half of Detroit's political establishment in prison." Darius felt the weight of the discovery crushing down on him. He wasn't just looking at a skeleton. He was looking at evidence that could bring down a criminal empire that had operated with impunity for half a century. "The combination," he said. "Do you know it? If we knew the combination, do you think Thomas would still be decomposing in there? He died before he could tell us. We've spent 40 years looking for those tapes." "What about the car accident? The body they found? Vagrant from the riverfront. Similar height and build. Car fire destroyed most of the evidence. Detroit police weren't inclined to look too closely at the details, especially after Tony made some generous donations to the Police Benevolent Fund. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Murder, evidence tampering, police corruption, all to protect a money laundering operation that had probably moved hundreds of millions of dollars. "Here's what's going to happen," Sterling continued. "You're going to walk away from that safe and never come back. In exchange, you keep breathing and that $5,000 offer stays on the table. And if I don't, then you'll join Thomas in that little room. Plenty of space left." The line went dead. Darius stood alone in the dark office, acutely aware that he was trapped. Sterling knew he was here, knew what he'd found, and had already demonstrated that the people he worked for were willing to kill to protect their secrets. But as he stared at Thomas Meridian's remains, Darius felt something unexpected. Anger. This man had died trying to expose the truth, and his murder had been covered up by corruption and intimidation. For 40 years, his family had probably wondered what happened to him. His children had grown up not knowing their father was a hero who'd tried to stand up to organized crime. Darius pulled out his phone and called Denise. "Do you know any federal agents?" he asked without preamble. "FBI, DEA, someone clean who can't be bought?" "Darius, what have you gotten yourself into?" "I found Thomas Meridian, and I think I know how to bring down the people who killed him." 20 minutes later, Denise called back with a name. Special Agent Sandra Mills, FBI Organized Crime Task Force. Mills had a reputation for integrity and a personal vendetta against the Torino family, who had been responsible for her partner's death 3 years earlier. But first, Darius needed to get into that safe, and he needed to do it before Sterling's people decided that talking was no longer sufficient. He examined the Mosler safe more carefully. It was a classic 1950s model with a mechanical combination lock. No electronics to bypass, just steel and precision engineering. The safe was built to last centuries, but it had one weakness that most people didn't know about. Darius's grandfather had been a locksmith before the war, and he'd taught Darius that every Mosler safe from this era had an emergency access panel on the back. It was designed for bank examiners and law enforcement, hidden behind a false back panel that could be removed if you knew what to look for. Working in the cramped space behind the safe, Darius found the hidden panel and carefully removed it. Inside was a secondary locking mechanism with a much simpler combination, usually the manufacturing date or serial number. The serial number was stamped on a plate inside the panel, 051952, May 1952. Darius tried the combination on the secondary lock. It clicked open immediately, disengaging the main lock mechanism. The massive safe door swung open with a whisper of well-oiled hinges. Inside was Thomas Meridian's insurance policy against the Torino family. Dozens of cassette tapes lined the shelves, each labeled with dates and initials. TT3-1573, VM7-2273, AF11-0873. Alongside the tapes were ledgers filled with handwritten entries, photographs of meetings, and copies of federal contracts that had never been fulfilled. But it was the manila envelope marked, "Insurance, open only if something happens to me," that made Darius's hands shake as he opened it. Inside was a letter addressed to the FBI, signed by Thomas Meridian, and dated October 12, 1974, 3 days before his supposed car accident. "If you are reading this, I am probably dead. For the past 3 years, I have been documenting a massive money laundering operation run by Anthony Tony Torino and the Torino crime family. My company, Meridian Electronics, was used to process over $12 million in illegal proceeds through fraudulent federal defense contracts. I have recorded conversations with Tony Torino, Vincent Torino, Angelo Torino, and dozens of their associates detailing the operation. I have also documented bribes paid to Detroit police officers, Wayne County officials, and federal contracting officers. The evidence is contained in this safe. The combination is my wife's birthday, 04/23/29. I pray that someday the truth will come out and these men will face justice for their crimes." Below his signature was a list of names: politicians, police officials, judges, federal employees, all of whom had taken money from the Torino organization. Darius photographed the letter and several of the most damning documents, then carefully selected 3 cassette tapes with the most recent dates. If Sterling was monitoring the building, he probably knew Darius had accessed the safe by now. Time was running short. As he prepared to leave, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Building is surrounded. Come out with your hands visible, or we come in shooting." Through the office window, Darius could see the shadows of armed men moving through the factory floor. Sterling hadn't been bluffing about having backup, but 40 years of planning had made them confident, perhaps overconfident. Darius still had one advantage. He knew the building better than they did, and he'd been a combat engineer in Afghanistan before his factory job. Urban warfare in an industrial setting was something he understood. He pocketed the cassettes and letter, then began his escape through the building's maze of equipment and ventilation systems. The Torino family had killed to protect their secrets for 4 decades. Tonight, those secrets were going to see the light of day. Darius moved through the factory's ventilation system like a ghost, using skills he'd hoped never to need again. The ductwork was solid 1950s construction, built to last and large enough for maintenance access. Behind him, he could hear Sterling's men spreading through the building, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as they searched for him. He had maybe 10 minutes before they thought to check the ventilation system. 10 minutes to get clear of the building and reach safety with evidence that could destroy a criminal empire. The main ventilation shaft led to the roof, but that would leave him exposed and trapped. Instead, Darius followed a secondary duct that connected to the building's old air conditioning system. The external unit was located in a service alley behind the factory. If he could reach it, he'd have a clear path to his truck. As he crawled through the narrow space, Thomas Meridian's cassettes pressed against his ribs like a physical reminder of what was at stake. 40 years of silence were about to end, but only if he survived the next hour. The ductwork terminated at an external grate that had been painted over multiple times. Darius used his multi-tool to cut through the paint and old caulking, then carefully pushed the grate outward. Fresh night air hit his face as he squeezed through the opening and dropped into the alley. His truck was parked 2 blocks away, but the streets between here and there were probably being watched. Darius pulled out his phone and called the one person he trusted completely. "Denise, I need help. Now." "Darius, where are you? I've been calling FBI agent Mills, but no time. I'm at the factory, and there are armed men trying to kill me. I have evidence of a 40-year-old murder and organized crime conspiracy. I need you to call 911 and tell them shots have been fired at the Meridian Electronics building on Corktown Avenue." "Jesus, Darius. Do it now. And call Agent Mills. Tell her I have the Torino evidence she's been looking for." He hung up and began moving through the shadows toward his truck, staying in alleys and avoiding main streets. Behind him, he could hear shouting from the factory as Sterling's men realized their quarry had escaped. Darius had almost reached his truck when a black Lincoln Town car turned onto the street ahead of him. He ducked behind a dumpster as the car slowed, its occupants scanning the area with handheld spotlights. The car stopped directly in front of his truck, Two men got out, Vincent Sterling and a younger man who moved like professional muscle. They examined Darius's truck. Then Sterling pulled out his phone. "He's here somewhere," Sterling said into the phone. "The truck's still warm. Spread out and find him." Darius was trapped between the Lincoln and the factory, with armed men closing in from both directions. But 40 years of military experience had taught him that sometimes the best defense was a good offense. He circled around behind the Lincoln, staying low and using parked cars for cover. When he was directly behind Sterling's position, he made his move. "FBI, drop your weapons!" The shout echoed off the buildings as Darius stepped into view with his hands raised, but speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. In the darkness and confusion, Sterling's associate spun toward the voice and instinctively dropped his gun. Sterling was smarter and more experienced. He immediately recognized the deception and reached for his own weapon. But the moment of confusion was all Darius needed. He dove behind Sterling's car as the first shot shattered a storefront window behind him. Sirens wailed in the distance. Denise had made the 911 call. Sterling heard them too and knew his window was closing. "Kill him and let's go," Sterling ordered his associate. But as the younger man moved to flank Darius's position, a new voice cut through the night. "Detroit police, everyone on the ground now." 3 patrol cars had arrived simultaneously, their spotlights flooding the area with harsh white light. Sterling's associate immediately threw down his weapon and surrendered, but Sterling himself had vanished into the shadows between buildings. 20 minutes later, Darius found himself in the back of an ambulance being checked for injuries, while Detective Ray Coleman took his statement. Coleman was an old-school Detroit cop with tired eyes and a reputation for honesty, exactly the kind of officer Darius needed. "Let me get this straight," Coleman said, reviewing his notes. "You bought an abandoned factory for $400, found a skeleton in a hidden room, and discovered evidence of a 40-year-old money laundering operation run by the Torino crime family." "I know how it sounds," Darius admitted, "but I have proof." He handed Coleman the cassettes and photocopies of Thomas Meridian's documents. Coleman examined them with growing interest. "I remember the Meridian case," Coleman said. "I was a rookie then, but something always bothered me about that car accident. The timing was too convenient. Thomas Meridian was murdered because he tried to expose the truth. The evidence in that safe can prove it." Coleman nodded. "We'll need to secure the scene and process everything properly. But Darius, you need to understand. If this evidence is real, you've just painted a target on your back that's never going away. The Torino family doesn't forget, and they don't forgive." As if summoned by his words, Coleman's radio crackled to life. "All units be advised. Federal agents are en route to the Meridian Electronics building. This is now a federal crime scene." Agent Sandra Mills arrived 30 minutes later with a full FBI evidence team. She was a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent years fighting organized crime. "Mr. Williams," she said, approaching Darius as he stood outside the factory, "Detective Coleman briefed me on your discovery. If what you've found is genuine, this could be the breakthrough we've needed for decades." "It's genuine," Darius assured her. "Thomas Meridian documented everything. Names, dates, amounts, methods. It's all there." Mills studied the photocopied documents Darius had provided. "These names, some of these people are still alive, still in positions of power. This evidence could expose corruption that goes all the way to the federal level. What happens now? Now we process the scene properly, authenticate the evidence, and build cases against everyone involved. But I have to warn you, this investigation will take months, possibly years, and the people you're exposing will do everything they can to stop it." As if to emphasize her point, Detective Coleman approached with disturbing news. "Vincent Sterling is gone," he reported. "We found the Lincoln abandoned 6 blocks away. No sign of the driver." Mills wasn't surprised. Sterling's real name is Vincent Torino, Anthony Torino's youngest son. He's been the family's cleanup specialist for 40 years. If he's involved, this goes all the way to the top of the organization. Over the next several hours, the FBI evidence team carefully extracted Thomas Meridian's remains and cataloged every item in the safe. The cassettes alone contained hundreds of hours of recorded conversations documenting the Torino family's operations in Detroit during the 1970s. But it was the ledgers that provided the roadmap for modern prosecutions. The money laundering techniques pioneered in the Meridian operation had evolved and expanded, becoming the foundation for a criminal empire that now spanned multiple states and industries. "This isn't just historical evidence," Mills explained to Darius as dawn broke over Detroit. "These methods are still being used today. The Torino family's current operations are built on the same foundation Thomas Meridian documented 40 years ago. So his death wasn't for nothing. His death is about to bring down one of the most powerful crime families in the Midwest, and you're the reason it's finally happening. But Mills' expression grew serious, which means you're also in serious danger. The Torino family has spent 40 years protecting these secrets. They won't stop now. As if summoned by her words, Darius's phone rang. The caller ID showed Vincent Sterling's number. "Answer it," Mills instructed, quickly setting up a recording device. "Keep him talking." Darius accepted the call with trembling fingers. "Congratulations, Mr. Williams." Sterling's voice was cold with fury. "You've just signed your own death warrant. The FBI can't protect you forever. It's over, Sterling. The evidence is out. Evidence can be discredited. Witnesses can be eliminated. The Torino family has survived worse than you. Not this time. Thomas Meridian made sure of that." Sterling's laugh was bitter. "Thomas Meridian was a dead man the moment he decided to record our conversations, just like you became a dead man the moment you opened that safe." The line went dead. Mills stopped the recording and looked at Darius with concern. "We're going to put you in protective custody until the trials are over," she said. "It's the only way to keep you safe." But Darius shook his head. "I'm not running. Thomas Meridian tried to do the right thing and paid for it with his life. If I hide now, his sacrifice means nothing. Darius, these people have killed before. Then help me make sure they can't kill again. Use me as bait if you have to, but don't let them win." Mills studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but we do this my way, with full FBI protection and surveillance. The moment something goes wrong, you disappear into witness protection." "Agreed." 6 months later, the trials began. The evidence from Thomas Meridian's safe had been authenticated and corroborated with modern financial records, revealing a criminal conspiracy that had operated for nearly 5 decades. Anthony Torino, now in his 80s, was charged with racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Vincent Torino faced additional charges of murder, attempted murder, and witness intimidation. But it was the revelation of the corrupted officials that truly shook Detroit. 3 former judges, a dozen police officers, 2 city council members, and a federal contracting officer were indicted based on evidence from the 1970s that connected to ongoing corruption in the present day. Darius testified for 3 days, telling the story of his discovery and the threats he'd faced. The courtroom was packed with media, family members of victims, and federal agents who had worked the Torino cases for decades. When the verdicts came in, the convictions were comprehensive. Anthony Torino was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Vincent Torino received 30 years for murder and conspiracy. The corrupt officials faced sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. But for Darius, the most meaningful moment came when Thomas Meridian's daughter, now in her 50s, approached him outside the courthouse. "Thank you," she said simply. "For 40 years my family wondered what happened to my father. We thought he was a criminal who ran away. Now we know he was a hero who died trying to do the right thing." 1 year after buying the factory for $400, Darius stood in the renovated building that now housed the Meridian Community Workshop, a job training center for unemployed Detroit residents. The FBI's reward for his cooperation had provided the funding, but it was the community's response that had made it a reality. The workshop taught welding, electronics, and other skilled trades to people who needed second chances, just like Darius had needed when he walked into that auction with his last $400. In Thomas Meridian's former office, now converted into a classroom, a plaque honored the man who had died trying to expose the truth. It read simply, "Thomas Meridian, 1932-1974. He chose justice over safety, truth over profit, and courage over fear." As Darius watched a new class of students learn welding techniques in the same space where illegal millions had once been laundered, he reflected on how a desperate gamble had become something larger than he'd ever imagined. He'd bought a factory for $400 and discovered that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that can't be purchased. Justice, truth, and the courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. The Torino family's 40-year reign of corruption was over. Thomas Meridian's sacrifice had finally been vindicated, and in Detroit, a city that had seen too much decay and corruption, a small factory had become a symbol of renewal and hope. Sometimes the best investments aren't measured in dollars, but in the lives they change and the truths they reveal. Thank you for following this story of courage, justice, and redemption. If you enjoyed it, Don't forget to like and subscribe for more extraordinary stories.